The split willow handle bit deeper each time the basket swung, and by the time Rebecca Larson reached the lower quay, her palms were striped red and damp with brine. Dawn had not yet lifted fully from the water. The harbour lay in a grey half-light that made every face look older and every stone slick with cold. Fish scales glittered in the gutters like broken glass. Nets steamed where they had been dragged in, and the smell of tar, salt, and old catch sat heavy at the back of her throat until swallowing became work. Her shawl had once been black wool. Wind and use had thinned it to a loose weave that let the weather pass through as if she wore lace. Wet hems slapped her calves. Her shoes took in water at the seams. She set the basket down near a stack of cod crates and flexed her fingers once, quickly, because the porters disliked pauses in anyone lower than themselves. One of them jerked his chin toward a crate stamped with a customs mark and said, "That one as well, girl. The clerk is waiting." No coin was offered, no name was used. She bent and lifted anyway because Lady Vale had said she would return with the market tally complete, or she would not return to table at all. And there had been no supper the previous night, only thin tea and silence while forks moved around her as if she were a draught under the door. The crate was heavier than she expected. Her grip slipped on the wet wood, and it struck the stones with a crack loud enough to turn heads. Laughter rolled over her from 3 men in oilskins and one fishwife with her apron tied high against the mess. The fishwife did not laugh cruelly, only tiredly, the way people laughed at rain they could not stop. A clerk near the custom house door glanced up from his ledger, saw her face, then looked back down as if the page required rescue from her existence. Rebecca crouched, gathered the split corner, and began lifting loose fish back into place by hand. Ice burned her skin. Salt worked into the tiny cuts along her knuckles and made them throb. A pair of silk skirts brushed the edge of her vision. A hired barouche had stopped to let 2 gentlewomen step around a puddle. One looked directly at Rebecca's bent back, at the patched seam running down her sleeve, and said to her companion in a clear, bored voice, "How quickly neglect breeds coarseness." The words landed without malice, because malice required effort. They moved on. The footman closed the carriage door with careful gloves that looked cleaner than anything she owned. Rebecca finished restacking the crate, nodded once to the porter, though he had not helped, and wiped her wet hands on her dress where the cloth had already gone stiff from old salt. She had been plain all her life in the mouths of those who needed her small. Plain child, plain posture, plain prospects. People said it with relief, as if the world had sorted itself correctly. In the market mirrors of rainwater and glass, she saw what they ignored because it did not flatter their judgments. Dark hair heavy even when pinned hard, a face narrowed by hunger but fine at the brow, eyes too large and too watchful for servility to sit naturally in them. The watching had come from her father. Captain Larson had taught her to read cloud banks before storms, and figures before men lied about them. At 13 she could calculate tide windows faster than his first mate. At 15 she copied manifests in a hand so exact that chandlers sent for her when clerks were drunk. He had smelled of tobacco and cedar shavings and sea-wool. He had called her Becca in the cabin and Miss Larson on deck, because he said forms mattered when men listened for weakness. Then fever took him in 4 days at the end of winter. The house filled with black cloth and callers, with solemn mouths. Within a year Lady Vale had remarried into title and moved through every room with rosewater and legal paper. The ledgers tangled. Debts appeared that no one had named while her father lived. Signatures surfaced in cramped ink that leaned the wrong way on the final stroke. The coastal cottage passed to Lady Vale under claim of settlement. Rebecca had carried one trunk to the attic and learned the exact sound of the bolt outside her door when punishment required reflection. "Move!" a porter snapped, and she stepped aside as a handcart rattled by. She took the next commission from habit more than instruction. 2 baskets to the smokehouse, a sack of lamp oil wicks to the chandlery lane, a bundle of oyster shells to a widow who paid in coppers and apology. Each errand lengthened the ache between shoulder and neck where the basket strap dragged, yet she kept her pace measured because haste invited spills, and spills invited laughter, and laughter, by the 3rd hour, began to vibrate under the skin like fever. At a corner near the sailmaker she passed the door of a bookseller where she had once stood at her father's side and argued over a map of the Skagerrak. She slowed in spite of herself. Through the front glass she saw a familiar spine in faded blue calf, then another. Her father's crest had been burned off both. Lady Vale had sold the lot by weight, not title, and the bookseller had purchased cheaply after dark. Rebecca did not stop. Stopping would have drawn the apprentice, and the apprentice had already been warned that Miss Larson was not to loiter unless she came with payment from Lady Vale herself. By the 2nd week of March she had taught herself to pass those windows without turning her head, but this morning the hunger made old losses brighter, sharper, less distant. She felt them as one felt cold iron at the wrist. At mid-morning she brought the tally slate to the counting shed and waited while Mr. Henshaw checked each mark. He tapped the chalk lines with a blunt nail and frowned at nothing in particular. 2 haddock baskets short, he said. I received both, Rebecca answered, voice low, formal, careful. You signed the transfer at dawn. He did not look up. Then your memory outruns your station. Take it with Lady Vale. The shed boy smirked without lifting his eyes from the quill he was trimming. Rebecca inclined her head because protest in that room had never once altered arithmetic. Outside a bell rang from the chapel lane. She counted the strokes and calculated tide in the same breath. High water would turn just after noon. A cutter anchored off Blackwater Point had shifted badly on the morning swell, and if its master waited past the turn, he would scrape keel on the shoal. She could see the chart in her mind, as if it was spread across her father's table, soundings pricked in iron gall ink, dangerous shallows penciled by his hand. Knowledge rose in her with useless precision. No one asked her about shoals now. No one asked her about any figure except what labour she could carry on an empty stomach. A knot of boys ran past with coils of rope and shouted over one another about a horse gone loose near the upper quay. The sound echoed off stone and then was swallowed by gulls. Lady Vale preferred this quarter of town for punishment because there were always witnesses. In the house on Vale Street she could strike with a fan and call it correction. At the quay she only needed to assign tasks beneath Rebecca's rank and then let the crowd do the rest. Humiliation delivered by strangers required no explanation at supper. It sat on the skin by itself. Mrs. Dobb, the pie seller near the Old Crane, watched Rebecca stagger under the 2nd fish crate and finally set down a heel of bread on her own stall edge when no one looked. Rebecca stopped as if to tighten her shawl, took the bread and hid it in her pocket with a nod that was almost a bow. She waited until she turned into Netta's passage before eating. The crust was hard enough to cut her gum, and she chewed slowly, eyes closed once because gratitude hurt nearly as much as hunger when it arrived in secret. At the end of the passage she paused beside a rain barrel and checked the cuff of her left sleeve. The seam had opened where the crate corner caught it. Beneath it, fading yellow marked old bruises in a line like thumbprints. She pulled the cloth down. In the attic trunk, under 2 winter chemises and a pair of stockings mended beyond grace, She had hidden the only page Lady Vale had not found when she sold the library. A tide table in her father's hand with notes in the margin, his script slanting firm as mast lines. Rebecca repeated one column now under her breath, numbers and moon phases steadying her pulse more surely than bread. When she returned to the quay proper, the day had brightened without warmth. Gentlemen in dark coats crossed toward the harbour office, with dispatch satchels tucked dry under their arms. A pair of custom house clerks stood near the steps and looked through her as though she were part of the mist. One recognised her name when a porter called it, and gave the smallest lift of brow, the acknowledgment of a former place now safely buried. The water slapped pilings in an impatient rhythm. Ropes creaked. A gull dropped, snatched refuse, rose again. Rebecca shifted the basket to her other hand and walked toward the upper rail where another load waited, shoulders set, mouth still, each step exact on slick stone. She moved as if balance were a private oath and no one had authority to witness it. At the upper rail the next load waited in 2 open hampers, silver herring laid over chipped ice that had already begun to melt into pink water, and Rebecca bent without ceremony, because standing idle earned comment from men who did not know her name and enjoyed pretending they did. The wicker rubbed the raw base of her thumb. She adjusted her grip and straightened, and the old ache beneath her ribs answered like a second pulse. It came most often when she lifted against the body's warning. It had begun the week her father died, when she had carried basins up and down the stair while the physician spoke in careful evasions, and the candles burned to stubs on every table in the house. Captain Larson had gripped her wrist once, in the final night, skin already too hot and too dry, and said through cracked lips, "You read the tide, Becca. Read men the same way." By dawn he was still. By noon the parlour was full of black wool and lowered eyes, and neighbours who said duty-heavy phrases about Providence. Lady Vale, then only Mrs. Larson by law and preference, had wept with a handkerchief pressed exactly to the corner of one eye, and accepted condolences as if receiving cards at a winter call. Rebecca remembered the smell of wax and camphor and rosewater layered over fever. She remembered how quickly mourning acquired ledgers. The solicitor came the 3rd day with packets tied in blue ribbon. He spoke of entangled obligations, deferred freight payments, promissory notes lodged against 2 vessels delayed by weather. He did not meet Rebecca's gaze when she asked to review the account books herself. Lady Vale answered before he could, "Children do not audit estates." Rebecca had been 19 then, and had copied manifests for half the harbour since 14. That evening she went to her father's study and found the desk locked. The key ring that had always hung beside the chart cabinet was gone. Within a fortnight Lady Vale had moved the chart cabinet out, sold the brass instruments, and burned old correspondence in the courtyard brazier, because, as she told the cook loudly enough for the maids to hear, "Sentiment does not settle debt." Rebecca carried the hampers towards the smokehouse lane, with that sentence beating in time to her steps. Debt had become the household god. Debt explained the disappearance of silver, then books, then rugs, then her mother's portrait from the upstairs landing. Debt explained why she ate after the servants, though she had been borne to the table now denied to her. Debt explained why Lady Vale remarried before the black crape had left the door, accepting Lord Vale's rings and title with a composure that did not tremble once at the church rail. When the new carriage arrived, lacquered and high-wheeled, Rebecca stood at an upper window in her father's old shirt and watched trunks she had packed with her own hands being loaded for the Vale Street townhouse. Lady Vale had looked up once, seen her in the glass, and smiled as if they shared a private triumph. By the time the chapel bell marked noon, she had delivered the fish and returned to the counting shed, where Mr. Henshaw made her wait while he sanded a page that had not needed sanding. A drop from her wet hem gathered at the edge of the plank floor and darkened the dust. "You have not accounted for breakage," he said at last, sliding the slate back with 2 fingers, as if even chalk from her hand might stain. "1 crate split." "From rotten timber," Rebecca answered. "The corner gave at first lift," he sniffed. "Then Lady Vale may absorb the loss, though I doubt she will thank you for generosity with her coin." She accepted the remark in silence because there were rooms where speech cost too much. Outside, a footman in Vale colours waited by the step, hat brim glossy with mist. He did not bow. He held out a folded note sealed with dark green wax and watched her break it. Lady Vale's hand ran angular and precise across expensive paper. "Return at once. Bring market account and key to attic trunk. Guests at 3. Do not present yourself in this state." Rebecca read it twice because the final line carried its own cruelty. This state meant cold reddened hands, salt at the hem, hair loosened by labour. It also meant visible hunger, which Lady Vale despised in others the way she despised any evidence that life required maintenance. Rebecca tucked the note into her pocket beside the last crumbs of Mrs. Dobbs' bread and crossed toward Vale Street with the basket empty and light for the first time that day. The townhouse doors stood open to admit air and admiration. Inside, heat pressed against her face from 2 coal grates. Beeswax and lavender replaced tar and fish. In the front drawing-room, her stepsisters sat near the window in pale muslin embroidered with tiny blue knots. Each knot, likely tied by a woman, paid less in a month than 1 gown cost to trim. They were nearly her age and had perfected the unison tilt of heads that made mockery look like breeding. One lifted a fan without opening it. "Rebecca has returned from her kingdom of herrings." The other glanced at Rebecca's sleeves. "How practical that she no longer fears stains." Lady Vale entered on a rustle of silk and the soft, chiming clink of bracelets. Her perfume arrived before she did. "You are late," she said. "The tea things require polishing. Mrs. Davies is occupied." Rebecca offered the folded tally with both hands. "Mr. Henshaw disputes 2 baskets and a breakage fee." Lady Vale did not take the paper. "Then you will make his ledger content. I will not underwrite your clumsiness." Her gaze shifted to Rebecca's pocket, where the edge of crust had marked the fabric. "And you steal from market stalls now." "Mrs. Dobb gave it." "As alms? How fitting." One stepsister laughed behind the fan, brief and sharp. The other reached to the side table where a small brass compass lay, newly polished, its lid engraved with C. Larson in worn letters. Rebecca's breath caught. The compass had lived on her father's desk for 20 years. She had wrapped it in linen and hidden it behind attic boards after the auction men came. "This is charming," the sister said. "Mamma, may I keep it for my reticule chain? It opens with such a pleasing click." Lady Vale glanced once and shrugged. "If it is in this house, it is ours." Rebecca stepped forward before caution could restrain her. "That instrument was my father's." Silence snapped taut across the room. Lady Vale's mouth thinned. "Your father settled nothing before he died. You speak of his belongings as though sentiment grants title." She held out her hand. "The trunk key." Rebecca closed her fingers around the iron in her palm. "There is nothing left to sell." "Then there is nothing to hide. Give it." Mrs. Davies appeared in the doorway carrying a tea tray, eyes down, knuckles white around silver handles. Rebecca felt the old servant's pause, the almost movement toward her, then the retreat into safety. The house had taught everyone its rules. Rebecca placed the key in Lady Vale's hand. Metal touched skin. Loss made no sound at all. The attic smelled of dust and damp wood when she climbed there after polishing the tea service and carrying sandwiches she was not offered to eat. Rain had begun, fine and persistent, ticking on the slates above her head. The trunk stood open. Drawers had been pulled and left gaping. Stockings lay on the floor like shed skin. The winter chemises were gone. The second pair of shoes, the less worn pair she had saved for church, gone. Her mother's cameo brooch, which had been cracked and therefore dismissed by buyers once before, gone now as well, likely boxed for a second attempt in London where strangers paid for stories as much as stone. At the bottom of the trunk, Lady Vale had left one thing by accident or contempt: a torn shift and the blue ribbon from an old chart tube, too faded to fetch coin. Rebecca knelt, palms on the rough boards, and forced her breathing even. This was how Lady Vale conducted siege, not with shouting, with subtraction, spoon by spoon, thread by thread, privacy first, then clothing, then food, then sleep, then name. In the months after the remarriage, she had stopped calling her Miss Larson before servants. She used girl, then child, then simply you, as if identity itself were wasteful. When callers came, Lady Vale told the story as entertainment dressed as regret. "My poor husband left us obligations I could not have imagined. We keep his daughter out of duty, of course." The phrase moved through drawing rooms faster than scandal, because it soothed the hearer. Duty offered by the powerful to the burdensome was a story every comfortable woman liked. Rebecca learned to carry coal through side passages, while guests admired porcelain in the rooms above. She learned which floorboards would not creak when she crossed the back landing after midnight to steal 10 minutes with a candle and one salvaged page from a navigation manual she had rescued before the auction men arrived. She learned that signatures told truths mouths concealed. The forged debt claims had all shared one flaw. Her father made his final stroke downward and blunt, a seaman's hand used to pressure and weather. The papers Lady Vale produced curled upward at the end, delicate, clerkly, practised by someone who had watched him and misunderstood what strength looked like. Rebecca had pointed this out once to Mr. Pike, the family solicitor newly eager to please Lord Vale's connections. He had folded his hands and replied, "Miss Larson, forgery is a grave accusation. It does not become a dependent female to make legal weather in a settled room." Settled room! She had heard the sea in that phrase for days, mocking and cold. 3 days later, Lady Vale locked the study and moved Rebecca to the attic permanently, saying the lower chamber was needed for linen inventory. The linen inventory never appeared. By the end of February, Mrs. Davies began slipping her broth in chipped cups after the kitchen slept, and old Thomas the groom left kindling by the back stair without comment. Both acts of loyalty so small they could survive in a cruel house because they looked like habit, if anyone noticed. She rose from the floor when voices floated up the stairwell, Lady Vale's low command and one sister's peal of answer, and crossed to the eave where the plaster had cracked enough to admit a wedge of harbour view. From there she could see the masts over rooftops, dark lines against a whitening sky, and beyond them the strip of water where her father had once pointed with mittened hand and asked her to name tide by colour alone. She had answered correctly. He had laughed, proud and astonished, as though she had built the moon herself. "You will never be at the mercy of men who misread water," he had said. Yet mercy was precisely the coin of her present life, dispensed and withdrawn by Lady Vale according to spectacle. Public labour in wet streets, supper withheld for imagined insolence, errands assigned to the farthest quarter so her shoes wore through by design. Last week Lady Vale had sent her with sealed invitations to houses that had once invited Rebecca by name. 2 butlers accepted the cards without letting her under the awning, while rain ran from her hair to her collar. One had looked at the wax and then at her face and asked, not unkindly, "Do you require directions to the servants' entrance, miss?" Miss had sounded like pity. She had thanked him and walked away before he could offer more. Pity was dangerous. It loosened resolve and made the next humiliation bite deeper. She touched the inner seam of her sleeve now, where she had sewn a narrow pocket by candlelight, hidden from quick searches. Inside lay the folded tide table in her father's hand, edges soft from rereading, numbers still exact. Lady Vale had taken books, room keys, meals, the cottage at North Spit under debt claims written in false ink, and even the compass that had rested against her father's pulse on winter crossings. But she had not taken this. Knowledge still lived where Silk could not reach. A knock struck the attic door, brisk and impatient. One of the sisters called through the panel, "Mamma says the market tally is wrong and you are to return at once. The upper key requires another count. Try not to disgrace us in front of the clerks this time." Footsteps retreated. Rebecca slid the tide table back into its seam, tied her shawl tighter, and went down without answering, carrying her hunger and her father's arithmetic like matched blades as she stepped again into the salt wind. She had taken only 6 steps down the back lane before the harbour swallowed her again, all noise and salt and men shouting over one another, as if volume might bend the tide. And when she reached the upper quay with Lady Vale's slate under her arm, she found the counting post crowded by drovers, fish factors, and 2 customs agents arguing over stamped barrels, while gulls wheeled so low their wings clipped mist from the rail. Rebecca moved along the stone edge where slick moss made footing uncertain, eyes on crate marks, lips soundless as she counted because numbers still obeyed even when people did not. A coil of wet rope struck her ankle. She steadied without looking up. A cartwheel splashed her skirt to the knee. She shifted the slate and kept moving. Then the crowd's rhythm broke. A horse screamed near the upper gate, iron shoes sparking on stone, and men lurched aside in a chain of startled bodies. The animal came riderless through the crush, lathered black and wild-eyed, reins trailing, shoulder clipping a post hard enough to crack wood. It slammed the key rail, reared and twisted free with a sound like tearing canvas. Something blue struck the paving 2 yards from Rebecca's boots. A boy. Naval blue coat. Midshipman braid darkened by rain and something darker. He hit on his side and did not rise. A folded packet shot from inside his coat and skidded under the fish cart wheel. Rebecca dropped the slate. Chalk snapped. She was on her knees before thought arrived, fingers at the boy's throat, pulse fluttering and fast, breath wet and uneven. His left sleeve was ripped open from elbow to wrist. Blood soaked wool and ran into the gutter in thin diluted threads. Voices crashed over her in fragments. "Do not crowd him." "Fetch a surgeon." "Whose lad is that?" Boots thundered closer behind her, then halted with abrupt control. A man's voice cut through the confusion, deep and level, and used to being obeyed at once. "Do not touch him." The command landed like a hand between her shoulders. She ignored it. She tore fabric from the opposite cuff seam, not the sleeve seam where her hidden tide table page was stitched, with her teeth and fingers, wrapped the cloth above the wound, and pulled hard until the boy cried out and his eyes opened to slits. "Stay with me," she said, bending close so he heard only her. "Breathe shallowly. Look at me." He tried to turn his head toward the water. She held him still with one hand under his neck and the other braced at his shoulder, feeling the tremor in his body, feeling her own hands shake from cold and hunger and strain. The horse had vanished into the lower market. Porters formed a ragged ring and stared. No one knelt. No one dirtied a sleeve. She heard the same voice again, nearer now, iron under restraint. "You were told to stop!" She tightened the improvised tourniquet one last turn, tied it, then reached under the cart to snatch the packet before a wheel crushed it. Red sealing wax stamped with a black crest, a crown above a thorn branch, not trade office, not local registry, military dispatch. The boy's fingers clawed weakly at her wrist. She tucked the packet against his chest, and when she looked up, she saw boots first, black and travel-streaked, then a greatcoat dark with spray, then a man whose stillness made the whole quay seem disorderly by comparison. He was tall enough that the crowd shifted around him without being told. Broad shoulders under wet wool, dark hair wine-thrown from hard riding, a jaw cut severe as if quarried from winter rock. His eyes fixed on Rebecca, not the blood, not the onlookers, only her face and then her torn cuff, and then the line of bruises that cloth no longer hid. She knew him one heartbeat later than she should have. Everyone at Blackwater Harbour knew him by sight or story, by tariff and title, and the way clerks stood straighter when his name was written across a page. Lord Adrian Thorne, Marquess of Blackwater. The man who controlled 3 coves, 2 customs leases, and half the packets that ran north in storm season. The man who had not set foot on Market Stone in years, if rumour spoke true. A boy in livery finally pushed through with a blanket. The Marquess took it without looking and dropped to one knee opposite Rebecca. Movement precise, efficient. "Give him to me!" She did not. "He will bleed again if the binding slips." "I can hold it." "You are faint." His gaze flicked to her mouth, to the white edge where she had bitten her own lip, then back to the wound. "You are shaking." "So is he." The words came out rougher than she intended. Rain began in a fine, hard drift, dotting the packet wax, the boy's lashes, the Marquess's coat. Somewhere behind them, someone said too loud, "That is Larson's step-girl." Another answered, "Lady Vale's burden, yes." The Marquess did not turn his head toward either voice. "Name?" "Rebecca Larson. You know how to bind an artery?" "My father kept ships." His eyes narrowed by a degree, measuring not claim but fact. "Captain Larson." She gave one short nod. Recognition moved across his face and vanished, replaced by command. "Porter, stretcher, now!" 2 men sprang to obey. One nearly slipped. By the time the chapel bell struck a single note over the rain, the boy was lifted and carried toward the surgeon's rooms above Cooper Lane, Rebecca still pressing the cloth because no one else kept the pressure steady enough. The Marquess walked beside her with one hand under the stretcher frame, coat sleeve brushing her shoulder each time the men staggered. At the lane mouth he stopped them. "Inside!" She moved to follow. His hand closed around her forearm. Not cruel, simply unarguable. "Not you. The binding may fail. The surgeon will take over. He may not listen quickly enough." A beat. He released her and looked to the door where the surgeon's apprentice already shouted for hot water. 2 minutes, he said, no more. It was not permission. It was an order shaped to sound like concession. Inside smelled of spirits, wool, and old smoke. The apprentice cut the sleeve. Rebecca repeated what she had seen, where the fall had struck, how long the boy had been conscious, and the surgeon nodded once with professional impatience that passed for gratitude. She stepped back when told. Her knees weakened all at once. She caught the table edge before she dropped. The Marquess saw it. Of course he saw it. He saw everything he chose to see, and she had no practice hiding from men like him, because men like him had never needed to look directly at her before. He took the sealed packet from where she had tucked it on the table and held it to the lamp. Water had blurred the outer script, but the superscription remained legible. Blackwater House, immediate. He broke the wax with his thumb, unfolded the sheet, and read standing still while rain hissed against the panes. She watched his face change by increments so small another woman might have missed them. The jaw tightened first, then the eyes lost surface and went hard as deep water in winter. He read the final line twice, folded the page. "Mr. Bellamy," he said to the surgeon without turning, voice now flat with dangerous economy, "this boy is under my protection. You will keep him alive." The surgeon drew up, offended. "I keep all my patients alive when they allow it." "Then begin with him." He looked at Rebecca. "Outside." She should have refused on principle alone. She obeyed because his tone carried urgency she recognized from storm commands on deck, the kind issued when there was no room left for pride. Rain hit colder beyond the doorway. Harbour noise returned, muffled now by weather and distance, and the Marquis stood close enough that she could smell horse and sea, and the faint, clean bite of steel oil beneath wet wool. He held out the opened letter. "Read." She hesitated. "It is addressed to you, my lord." "Read." She took it. The hand was hurried, blotted in 2 places, signed by a harbour office clerk she remembered from childhood, Mr. Nile, a cautious man who never risked ink without proof. The lines were short and coded in shipping shorthand her father had taught her. Sale of route schedules to unauthorised parties. Signal lamps altered on the South Shoal. Names withheld pending safe testimony. Final line plain, no code at all. Lady Vale seeks removal of Miss R. Larson by contract marriage or sea transfer before inquiry. Records believed in her possession. Rebecca read it once. Again. The page trembled. Not from rain. "This is false," she said, because the alternative was too large to hold in one breath. "Mr. Nile does not write false dispatches." "Lady Vale has no claim to Crown Lanes." "She has men who believe she does." He took the paper back and folded it into his inner coat. "And she has named you collateral." The word struck harder than insult. Collateral meant object, transferable. A cargo line item with a female face. She lifted her chin. "Who sent the boy?" "One of my harbour runners. He was attacked before he reached my office." "By whom?" "Men who did not wish this delivered." His gaze dropped again to her torn sleeve. "How many meals have you had in 2 days?" The question was so abrupt she almost laughed, except nothing in him suggested jest. "That is not your concern." "It is now." She drew back a fraction. "By what authority?" He stepped closer, instead of answering, rain running from his hair to his collar, his voice lowered but no less hard. "You are starving, you are shaking. Someone has marked your arms and sent you to carry freight in a storm. Do not attempt to persuade me this is household comfort." Heat rose to her face, not from shame alone, but from the shock of being named accurately in open daylight. People saw her labour. They did not name it. People saw bruises. They looked away. He looked directly at what others erased and made it evidence. She heard herself say, "I am expected back at Vale Street." "You are not returning there." "I have no legal shelter elsewhere." "You will have one." "At what price?" His expression did not shift. "Your safety first. Terms later." She stared at him, measuring trap against necessity, and hated that necessity looked so much like rescue when spoken in a command voice. A custom house runner splashed up the lane, breathless, cap in hand. "My lord, Harbour Office requests you at once." They found one of the key guards with silver in his pocket and Vale seals in wax. The Marquis's focus never left Rebecca. "Name?" "Pritchard, sir. He admits to taking instructions regarding a female passenger list." Rebecca felt the ground tilt, not physically, but with the clear dislocation of hearing one's private dread spoken by strangers as procedure. Her name was now a list item in men's mouths. The Marquess made his decision in the same second. Go back, lock the office. Admit no one without my signet. The runner fled. Thorn turned to Rebecca. Listen carefully. She did. Her pulse beat at her throat so hard it hurt. An outbound packet leaves on the turning tide for Whitcliffe Priory. You will board it under my order. No! Yes. You cannot compel me. I can if the alternative is your seizure before sunset. By Lady Vale. By anyone she has paid. The rain strengthened, drumming on slate, washing fish scales toward the gutter. Two dockmen paused to stare at them, and then thought better of it when the Marquess glanced their way. Rebecca held his gaze. If I leave, she takes what remains of my father's records. If you stay, she takes you. The words were not raised, they cut cleaner for it. She swallowed. You ask trust without proof. I offered proof, you read it. A letter may be forged, not by Nile in that hand. He pulled a signet from his glove and pressed it briefly to the back of her knuckles, the metal cold enough to sting. The crest matched the wax from the dispatch exactly. I do not have the luxury of persuading you gently, Miss Larson. She withdrew her hand. And I do not have the luxury of obedience. Something shifted in his face then. Not softness, not yet, but a recognition like flint striking stone. Good, he said quietly. Keep that when you board. She should have asked what he meant. She should have asked why Whitcliffe, why now, why her father's name had altered his tone by a single degree. Instead, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Mrs. Dobb from the pie stall at the lane mouth, apron soaked, eyes wide. The older woman did not approach. She only called, voice shaking with effort. Miss Larson, do not go home. Lady Vale has men waiting by the back gate. Rebecca did not move at first. Rain ran from the edge of her shawl to her wrists. Mrs. Dobb stood at the lane mouth, chest lifting hard, one hand braced on the post, as if she had run farther than her age allowed. The pie-seller's apron was streaked with flour and rain and fish grit. Nothing in her face suggested rumour. Lord Thorn turned toward her. How many men? 2 I saw, perhaps 3 waiting in shadow. One had a sailor's knot tattoo at the neck. They asked the scullery maid when Miss Larson would be sent back. They had a carriage with no crest. Mrs. Dobbs swallowed. I told no one where she was. I came here straight. You did well, he said. The words were simple. They landed on the older woman like warmth. She gave one jerking nod and backed away before anyone could observe gratitude and punish it later. Rebecca found her own voice. If they are at the gate, then Lady Vale already knows I did not return. She knows only that she has lost control of 1 hour, Thorn said. I intend to keep the next. He signalled to the runner who had not yet reached the corner. The young man returned at once, dripping and breathless. 2 guards to the Cooper Lane surgery. Lane. 2 more to Vale Street back passage. You will not engage. You will watch and report. The runner sprinted off without question. Rebecca steadied herself against the wall. My trunk is there. His gaze shifted to her face. Clothing can be replaced. Not that. She kept her voice low because saying its value aloud felt like offering it to theft. There may be records in the attic that Lady Vale has not found. He studied her for 1 beat. Can you prove they exist? I can prove she searched for them. That is not the same. No, she said, it is enough to begin. A shout broke across the rain from the quay steps. Men gathered near the customs arch, not with the idle posture of spectators, but with that ugly lean of a crowd deciding whether someone fallen was worth lifting. Thorn looked once, then began moving. Rebecca followed before he could forbid it. The stones were slick, her shoes skidded at the edge of a gutter. He caught her elbow and released it only when she found her balance. Under the arch, a uniformed keyguard lay against a crate, cap gone, temple split where it had struck brick. His breathing came quick and shallow. Silver coins were scattered in the rain around him like bright eyes. One docker laughed harshly. "Leave him! Pritchard sold every name on the passenger roll." Another spat near the man's boots. "Let him rot!" Pritchard! The same name the runner had spoken. Rebecca stopped hard enough that pain flashed up her shin. Hatred would have been easy. The guard had taken coin to mark her for seizure. He had weighed her life against silver and chosen profit. Yet his hands shook as he tried to push himself upright, and he failed. Thorn's voice cut through the muttering. "Stand back!" No one argued with that tone. They shifted, grumbling, but they shifted. "Leave him for my men," Thorn said to Rebecca, already turning toward the harbour office door. She was kneeling before he finished the sentence. Rain had washed most of the blood from Pritchard's brow, leaving a thin red line and skin gone grey with shock. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse erratic, but present. She pulled the strip of linen she had torn earlier from where it hung damp at her waist and folded it to a pad. "He betrayed you," Thorn said behind her. "He is breathing," she answered. Pritchard's eyelids fluttered. His mouth worked. No sound came. She lifted his chin to clear his airway and braced her shoulder against his as another wave of dizziness struck him. "Look at me," she said. "Do not sleep. Breathe with me, slow." He focused on her with difficulty, recognized her, and flinched with something close to shame. A fish factor barked a laugh. "Mercy for that one. You are a fool, girl." Rebecca did not turn. "Bring water." No one moved. Thorn spoke without raising his voice. "You heard her." A dock apprentice ran for a bucket as if chased. By the time the harbour bell marked noon, rain had thickened into a slant that blurred masts into charcoal lines. Rebecca held pressure on Pritchard's wound while the apprentice returned with water and a clean rag stolen from some honest task. She cleaned the cut enough to see it clearly, then bound it tight. The guard gripped her wrist with cold fingers. "I took coin," he whispered, each word scraped raw. "I did not know. They meant to take you offshore." "Who struck you?" Thorn asked. Pritchard's gaze slid to him and away. "Veil man, red scarf. Said I talked too much." "Names. Crow, maybe false." He swallowed hard. He asked where Captain Larson kept old manifests. Lady said the girl had charts sewn in her clothes. His eyes flicked to Rebecca's sleeve with a sick recognition. "I told him I did not know. He hit me and took my key." Rebecca felt the hidden fold of paper against her arm, as if it had suddenly turned to iron. Lady Vale had searched for more than property. She had searched for proof. "Key to what?" Thorn said. "The signal shed ledger chest on South Shoal." Pritchard coughed. "I copied arrivals there in Storm Week. Larson marks still in margins. Tide corrections. He wrote warnings about false lamps. Lady paid for those pages first." The rain seemed to recede for one strange second. Her father's hand, her father's marks. Not memory. Record. Thorn crouched opposite her now, coat dark with wet eyes, intent. "Can you stand, Pritchard? With help!" Rebecca shifted first, sliding her arm under the guard's shoulders before he tipped sideways. He was heavier than he looked. Her own strength wavered, then held. 2 dockmen came reluctantly when Thorn pointed at them. Together they lifted Pritchard onto a handcart padded with sailcloth. As they started toward the office, one man muttered, "Waste of good canvas!" Rebecca looked up at him with a steadiness that surprised even her. "You will keep him level. He is a witness." The man stared, then obeyed. Thorn said nothing. She felt his attention at her back like a physical weight as they crossed the threshold. The harbour office smelled of wet wool, sealing wax and coal smoke that never quite warmed the room. Mr. Niles stood behind the central desk, ink already set out. 2 clerks flanking him with stiff faces and sharpened quills. His thin hair clung to his temple in damp strands. He looked from Thorn to Rebecca, to the blood seeping through Pritchard's bandage, and did not waste a breath on preamble. "Statement now," Niles said, "before he loses coherence." Pritchard was lowered onto a bench. Rebecca remained near his shoulder, counting his breaths under her own. Niles began. "State your name and post." "Elias Pritchard, Upper Quay Guard, night and tide duty." "Did you accept payment from agents of Lady Vale to alter passenger logs?" A long pause. Pritchard shut his eyes once and reopened them. "Yes." "Did those agents request unlawful seizure of Rebecca Larson?" "Yes." "Purpose? Removal by marriage contract or sea transfer? Told me she was debt property?" He winced as Rebecca tightened the cloth where blood welled again. "Said no magistrate would ask after one dependent woman." Niles' jaw hardened. He wrote without looking up. "Did you provide key access to South Shoal signal chest?" "No, key was taken by force after refusal." Thorn's hand rested on the desk edge, still as carved stone. "Record the assault and theft under Crown obstruction." Niles nodded and wrote the phrase in full legal form. A knock sounded at the outer door. A junior clerk opened it and froze. Lady Vale's steward entered, immaculate despite the rain, hat brim dry under a waxed cloak. He carried a folded document with red ribbon and a practised expression of injured propriety. "My Lord Blackwater." He bowed to Thorn, then turned to Niles. "I bear authority from Lady Vale concerning her stepdaughter, Miss Larson, whose health has become unstable. She wandered from a lawful guardianship this morning, and now appears entangled in dockside confusion. I request immediate return into family care." He offered the paper as if placing a card at tea. Rebecca felt the room tilt toward him. Words like unstable, wandering, family care. Each one chosen to erase her testimony before she spoke it. Neil did not take the document. "This office records maritime offences, not drawing-room disputes." The steward smiled faintly. "Then you will be relieved to avoid them. Miss Larson has no independent standing." Thorn had not moved. "She has mine." The steward's smile thinned. "Your lordship is generous." "Generosity does not alter lineage." Rebecca stepped forward before caution could restrain her. Her voice emerged clear, colder than she felt. "Lineage is not your argument. Silence is." The steward's eyes narrowed. "Miss Larson, you are distressed. If you will simply state that you came here by misunderstanding, this unpleasantness can end." He angled the ribboned paper toward her. At the bottom lay a blank space for her mark. She looked at the line, then at him. "I do not misunderstand my own abduction." The words struck the room flat. The steward recovered quickly. "A dramatic phrase. You have always enjoyed stories." She should have looked away. She did not. "You waited at the Vale Street back gate with 2 men and a carriage lacking crest. One wore a sailor's knot tattoo at the neck. One carried a red scarf and struck this guard when he refused your second demand. You asked for my return before sunset because the packet tide turns then and witnesses thin after dark." Niles' quill raced across the page. The clerk stopped, pretending indifference. The steward's composure cracked by a fraction. "Wild invention." Rebecca lifted her chin toward Pritchard. "He has confirmed your coin and your request." Pritchard opened one swollen eye and whispered, barely audible, "Red scarf." Thorn turned to the junior clerk at the door. "Detain him!" The steward stepped back. "You have no warrant." Niall finally took the ribboned paper, glanced at the seal, and let out a quiet, incredulous breath. "This writ is not entered. The magistrate mark is copied. Poorly." He held it up to the lamp. The inked signature curled upward at the last stroke. Exactly wrong. Rebecca felt something sharpen into place inside her, the old training of eye and hand. She crossed to the desk and spoke without tremor. "May I?" Niall yielded the page. She traced the final stroke in air, not touching. "Captain Larson taught me this magistrate's hand when I copied customs manifests as a child. He always blunted the last stroke downward because his wrist was damaged in service. This line rises. It is imitation." Niall set the writ down as if it contaminated the blotter. "Noted, the steward backed toward the door. The junior clerk, suddenly brave with authority present, blocked him with both arms. Outside, boots pounded on wet stone as Thorne's summoned guards arrived. While the room surged toward that smaller conflict, Rebecca felt the hidden paper against her sleeve again. Her father's tide table, his marginal notes, the one relic she had guarded through every search and subtraction. If Pritchard spoke true, matching entries might still exist at South Shoal. But this page could anchor chain of custody now. Without it, Lady Vale could claim every correction was copied later. She turned slightly away from the crowd and slipped 2 fingers into the seam she had stitched by candlelight months ago. The thread resisted. She tore it with her nail. The folded sheet came free, softened by wear, edges feathered from being handled in the dark when hunger and fear made sleep thin. She held it a moment longer than necessary. Then she placed it on Neil's desk. "This is Captain Larson's tide hand from March storms 3 years past," she said. "Compare the correction marks to any log you recover from South Shoal. If they match, you have provenance. If they do not, you have alteration." Niall stared at the page as if she had set down a gold bar, then looked at her with a kind of stunned respect he had never shown when she was 19, and asking to audit her own father's books. "Miss Larson, this may be decisive. It was never meant to leave me," she said, and that was all she allowed herself. She did not see Thorne step closer. She only sensed the stillness that came when he stopped it at her shoulder. His voice, when it came, was low enough that only she heard. "You gave away your last shield." She kept her eyes on the desk. "I gave evidence." A breath passed. Rain hammered the windows. Pritchard groaned on the bench. The steward shouted at the guards and was answered by iron restraint and procedure. Thorne spoke again, barely above the storm. "You saved the boy. You saved the guard who sold you. Now you surrender the one thing she could not take. Do you do anything for your own survival, Miss Larson?" The question went through her like cold water. She answered without looking at him. "Yes, I choose where I stand." For the first time since she had met him, silence from Lord Adrian Thorne did not feel like distance. It felt like impact. Niall sanded the final line of Pritchard's sworn statement, then lifted his head. "My lord, the packet for Whitcliffe signals departure in 20 minutes. If Miss Larson is to travel under protection, she must move now. I will dispatch 2 copies of this testimony to the magistrate and 1 to Crown Shipping Command before the hour turns." Thorne nodded once. "Do it." He extended his hand to Rebecca, not as ownership, not as command, but as passage through a room that had finally begun to see her and might yet devour her for it. She took it because time was closing and the tide waited for no one, and together they stepped back into the rain where the departure bell had already begun to ring. Rain drove at them in thin, hard lines as they crossed from the harbour office to the east jetty, Thorne's hand still around hers, warm and unyielding despite the cold. Men moved aside when they saw his face. Women with baskets pressed themselves against wet stone. The departure bell swung and struck again, each note dull with weather. Rebecca kept pace because stumbling now would feel like surrender, and she had surrendered enough things for one lifetime. By the time they reached the jetty steps, the second bell was sounding over the tide. The packet waited below, black-hulled and narrow, her name painted in white along the stern. Merrow. Deck lanterns swung in the wind. Sailors hauled the last cargo net aboard, while the mate shouted weights into a ledger and swore at a knot that would not cinch cleanly. The sea beyond the breakwater had gone iron grey. White foam struck the pilings and broke into spray that tasted bitter on Rebecca's lips. Thorne released her hand only to speak to the captain, a weathered man with a scar through one eyebrow and the fixed patience of those who trusted weather more than rank. Captain Ellicott, Miss Larson travels under my protection. She disembarks at Whitecliff only. No unmarked boarding. No changes to route. If challenged, you run signal black and report direct to Priory Station. Ellicott's eyes flicked to Rebecca and back. Aye, my lord, 2 deckhands on her door at night watch. 4, the captain gave a short nod. 4. Thorne drew off one glove and pressed his signet into a lump of hot wax on a folded order sheet, then handed it over. Ellicott tucked it into his coat without opening it. Agreement done. Chain of command sealed. Rebecca stood in the rain and watched men decide her movement in 12 sentences. I can walk myself aboard, she said. Thorne turned. Water ran down his jaw and darkened the knot of his cravat. Then do it. No softness. No apology. She stepped onto the gangplank, skirts heavy at her calves, palms still burning where split willow had cut them at dawn. Halfway up, she looked back, despite herself. He had not moved from the foot of the plank. He stood with shoulders squared against the weather, eyes fixed on her as if memorizing each step. On deck, a sailor took her elbow and guided her toward the after cabin. She pulled free with a quiet, I am steady. He muttered respect and let go. The cabin assigned to her was narrow but clean. A berth bolted to one wall. A small table, 2 hooks for wet clothes, 1 brass lamp hooded against the sway. The single round window was clouded by spray. Somewhere below, cargo thudded into place. She did not sit. Sitting felt dangerous. If she sat, she might shake. A knock sounded once, then the door opened without waiting for reply. Thorne entered, filling the small space with wet wool, rain, and an authority that made the cabin seem suddenly built for confession rather than transit. He shut the door behind him. Sound from the deck dulled to rope creak and muffled shouts. You have 5 minutes, he said, to thank you or to obey you. To listen. She folded her arms to hide that her fingers had begun to tremble. Then speak plainly. His gaze tracked to her left sleeve, where the seam hung torn from where she had removed the tide table. You kept your father's page hidden in that cuff for months. She went still. He continued, voice level. You ripped the right cuff for bandages on the key and kept the left intact. You guarded one arm in every crowd, even when you were half frozen. She had not known he had noticed. Not that. Not so quickly. Shame and anger crossed like blades in her chest. You watch very closely for a man with so much else to command. I watch what threatens my harbour. I am not your harbour. His jaw tightened. No, you are a witness, with evidence half the coast would pay to erase. The words should have chilled her more than they did. Instead they steadied. Brutal truth had weight. It could be held. False kindness slid through the hands and vanished. Then why come yourself, she asked, when any officer would serve? Because officers can be bought. The answer came too fast to have been prepared. He stepped nearer the table but did not touch it. as if forcing distance by discipline alone. "You will remain in this cabin when ordered. You will eat what is brought, even if you despise the taste. You will answer only to Ellicott and to the woman waiting at Whitecliff Priory, Mrs. Calder. You will not give your name to strangers. You will not go on deck after nightfall without escort. A prison with better manners. A fortress with a bolt that locks from your side." She drew breath to argue again. He cut across it, not louder, only harder. "Miss Larson." Something in the way he said her name made her hold still. "You asked at the office whether I compel at price. Here is the price. I send you where Lady Vale cannot reach in one night. I remain and drag every paper into open court. If I fail, you still live. If you stay, she may take both witness and evidence in one stroke." His eyes held hers without flinching. "I will not permit that arithmetic." She felt her throat constrict. It was not tenderness he offered. It was strategy edged with something raw he had no language for. "You speak as though my life is an entry in your ledger." He gave one sharp, humorless exhale. "Everything in my world becomes ledger sooner or later. Tonnage, debt, men lost in winter crossings." A beat passed. Names I could not recover. There it was, close to pain and fiercely controlled. The wound beneath the stone face people described in drawing rooms where nothing cost blood. She heard herself ask, quieter, "And I am now one of those names?" "Not if I can prevent it." He reached into his coat and set something on the table between them. Brass, worn at the hinge, the engraved initials nearly rubbed smooth by years of handling. Her father's compass. The room seemed to tilt and settle again. "Where?" "Taken from your stepsister's reticule in a household parcel the steward brought from Vale House as leverage. My guards searched it when they detained him." He did not look at the compass. He watched her face. "I thought you should carry one thing that points true." Her hand hovered above it, but did not touch. Fear moved through her in a strange new shape. Not fear of Lady Vale. Fear of what it meant to receive something back and feel how much it mattered. A heavy bootfall sounded outside. A sailor's voice called through the wood, "Lines casting in 2 minutes, my lord." Thorn did not answer at once. He remained where he was, as if the order outside had reached some lesser version of him and had yet to reach this one. Then he said, "Hold." Silence returned. The lamp flame shivered. Rebecca wrapped both hands around the compass at last. Cold metal, familiar weight. Her father's thumb had polished one edge bright where it opened. Tears burned and did not fall. She swallowed them down because weeping in front of power had always been punished. Thorn saw the effort. Of course he saw it. "You did not break when they stripped your trunk," he said, voice lower now. "You held when she sent you hungry into the market. You endured while they called you burden to your face. You will not break on this crossing either." She stared at him. "Who told you that?" "No one. I watched you on the quay for 10 minutes before the horse struck." His mouth set, almost grim at his own admission. "You shifted weight to your left foot every third step because your right shoe seam is split. You counted crates under your breath to keep from swaying. You touched your pocket twice and never ate what was in it. Then you gave your last crust to the surgeon's apprentice when he ran for water." She had not realized he had been there long enough to see any of it, much less all of it. Heat climbed her neck. Exposure felt like standing in winter surf. "You had no right to study me." "No," he said, "I had no right." The words hung between them, unadorned, irrevocable. Outside, the sailor called again, louder, "My lord, tide is turning." Thorn stepped back at last, each movement controlled like a man forcing his own body into retreat. "Stay aboard. That is an order." She lifted her chin in reflexive resistance. "I do not take orders well. I am aware." A faint shift touched his mouth. Not a smile, not yet, but the smallest crack in frozen ground. Then it was gone. He opened the door, paused on the threshold, and looked over his shoulder. "I sent you away for your safety," he said. "Do not make me regret being right." He left before she could answer. Deck noise swelled as sailors hauled lines and shouted depth. Rebecca moved to the porthole and wiped condensation with her sleeve. Through warped glass, she saw him on the jetty, coat unbuttoned in rain, one hand bare, the other gloved, face lifted toward the deck where her cabin lay hidden. Men hurried around him with hooks and rope and crates. He did not shift aside. He stood like an anchored post while the world rushed past. The Merrow lurched as the first line dropped. Wood groaned. Water slapped harder against the hull. A bell rang from the bow. The gangplank was drawn in. For one breath she thought he would board after all, that he would stride up the plank at the final second and turn command into presence. He did not. The packet eased from the jetty and swung toward the channel mouth. Wind caught the forward sail with a crack. Rain blurred the shore into smudged stone and dark figures. Thorn remained visible longer than anyone else because he did not move when the others scattered to shelter. He watched until distance thinned him to silhouette, then to a single dark stroke against pale surf. A soft knock came at her door. "Miss Larson," a deckhand said, respectful now. "Captain sends broth and bread." She opened. A tray waited, steam rising from a chipped bowl, 2 thick slices beside it, and a folded wool blanket. The deckhand looked at her torn sleeve, then quickly away. "Orders were clear," he said. "You are to eat while it's warm." She almost refused out of habit. Habit had kept her upright in a cruel house, but habit had also starved her. She took the tray. "Thank you." When she closed the door, the cabin swayed with the first true push of open water. She sat on the berth at last, set the compass beside the bowl, and forced herself to eat slowly, though hunger urged haste. Salt broth, onion, barley. The bread was coarse and fresh enough that it yielded under her fingers. Warmth spread through her stomach in painful increments, like thaw in frost-bitten hands. On the table the compass needle quivered, then settled north. She held it in her palm after the last spoonful, listening to the sea strike the hull in steady blows. Not gentle, not kind, steady. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and leaned back against the timber wall as the packet cleared the harbour mouth and turned toward Whitecliff. Outside, beyond rain and distance, Lord Adrian Thorn remained ashore to face the court, the forgeries, the men who had sold routes and names. He had sent her away as if issuing a military order. He had returned her father's compass with bare hands. He had said he had no right to watch, and had watched anyway. In the narrow cabin, with stormlight fading at the round window, Rebecca closed her fingers around the brass and obeyed him in the only way that mattered. She stayed alive. The first true night wave struck the Merrow broadside just after moonrise, and the lamp in Rebecca's cabin jumped so hard that hot oil spat across the table and hissed beside her father's compass. She caught the brass before it slid, rose to brace herself against the wall, and smelled smoke under the salt and tar, faint at first and then sudden and thick as pitch. A shout tore across the deck. Another answered from below. The ship lurched again, and this time the cry was clear. "Galley fire!" She was in the passage before caution arrived. Smoke rolled low along the planks, stinging her eyes and filling her mouth with bitter heat. Men ran past, carrying buckets that sloshed black water over their boots. One deckhand coughed against the rail, doubled over, while another fought a jammed hatch with both hands. Near the mast steps, a small boy in a rough wool coat stood frozen, no more than 8, face grey with terror, his father shouting his name from somewhere beyond the smoke where flame lit canvas orange. Rebecca reached him in 3 strides, dropped to his height and gripped his shoulders. "Look at me. We go where the smoke thins. Hold my hand and do not let go." He nodded once, lips shaking, and she pulled him low, counting breaths, tracking the wind by the way the smoke dragged starboard. Her father's tide lessons returned as instinct. Air moved cleaner near the lee rail. She took him there by memory and feel. A body blocked the passage to the aft ladder. She nearly stumbled over him. First Mate Harlan lay on his side, hands blistered and red where he had torn burning cloth from a line. He tried to rise and failed with a strangled sound. Rebecca pressed the child behind her and tore the blanket from a storage peg, soaked one corner in a sloshed bucket, and wrapped Harlan's hands before he could claw at them again. "Keep these wet," she ordered the nearest sailor, thrusting the bucket toward him. He stared at her as if seeing an apparition in smoke, then obeyed. The child clung to her skirt and coughed. She bent to lift him, but a blast of heat drove them both back as the galley door gave way inward with a shower of sparks. For one hard minute she believed Thorn had kept his order and stayed ashore, and she hated him for being right, if right meant absence. Then a smaller cutter slammed alongside through spray and darkness, hooks biting the packet's rail, and Lord Adrian Thorn came over the side through smoke with 2 harbour men at his back, coat stripped, shirt plastered to his shoulders, face streaked with soot and sea. He saw her at once, saw the child in her arms, saw Harlan on the deck, and crossed to them with that same controlled violence she had first seen on the quay. His hand closed around the boy, steady and careful. "Stay." The single word held command and plea in equal measure. She did not move. He did not ask again. Together they pushed the child into waiting arms at the ladder and drove the last men clear of the galley passage, while Ellicott's crew smothered the flames under wet sailcloth and sand. By the time the fire guttered to steam and char, Rebecca's throat burned raw and her knees shook so hard she had to brace against the mast to remain upright. Thorn stood an arm's length away, chest heaving once, then still. "I sent you ahead because they were ordered to take you alive," he said, voice hoarse with smoke and restraint. "I followed on the next tide because distance had become another form of failure." By dawn the storm had broken into hard, pale light over Whitcliffe shingle, and the sea struck the stones in relentless, even blows. Survivors from the Merrow sat wrapped in blankets near driftwood fires, while the Priory men counted names. The deckhand's boy slept against his father's shoulder, breathing cleanly at last. Harlan lay with his hands properly dressed by the Priory surgeon, and managed a grim nod when Rebecca passed. She found Thorn at the waterline, boots in the wash, hair damp and wind-tossed, a leather packet tucked under his arm. When she stopped beside him, her teeth began to chatter from cold and aftermath. He took off his greatcoat and set it around her shoulders without comment. She held it closed and asked, quiet but clear, "Does it hurt to command what you cannot bear?" He looked at her then, and for one long breath he did not answer. His hand tightened over the packet. When he opened it, she saw her father's recovered manifest ledger inside, edges charred, Larson's hand unmistakable in the margin corrections. 2 days later, under a grey noon sky, the magistrate court at Blackwater Hall was so crowded that clerks stood along the wall and wrote on ledgers held against their palms. Niall had done exactly what he promised. Copies of Pritchard's sworn statement were entered at first call. Crown Shipping Command had replied before morning with seizure reports from 2 raider sloops that carried altered route slips bearing veil marks. Pritchard, pale and bandaged, gave his testimony seated and did not retract one word. Mrs. Dobb repeated what she saw at the Vale back gate. Mrs. Davies, hands folded so tightly her knuckles whitened, confirmed the trunk searches, the withheld meals, and Lady Vale's instructions to keep Rebecca in public labour where she could be watched by all and helped by none. The harbour runner identified the steward, and the forged writ recovered at the office. The junior clerk, who blocked the door, identified the seal as false. Each thread that had been rumour became record in ink. Lady Vale entered in dark plum silk with lavender at her wrists, chin high, expression composed enough for a ballroom. She called Rebecca hysterical, ungrateful, and unfit to hold property. She called Thorne compromised by sentiment. She called Pritchard a thief and Niall an alarmist clerk. The magistrate listened without interruption, then asked for the writ. Rebecca watched his face as he studied the final signature stroke under magnifier glass. Upward curl. Wrong hand. He requested Captain Larson's tide page from evidence. Then the South Shoal Ledger Thorne's guards had recovered from the signal chest after subduing Crow at dawn near the old Beacon Road. Marginal corrections matched stroke for stroke, pressure for pressure, downstroke blunt where the damaged wrist forced it. Niall read the comparison aloud. Silence filled the room like a held tide. The magistrate's ruling came standing. Forgery, coercive confinement, conspiracy against Crown shipping lanes, and attempted unlawful transfer of person are entered against Lady Vale pending transport for trial at Circuit Assize. He turned to Rebecca. The court restores Miss Larson's inheritance claim to the North Spit cottage and attached shipping interests under supervised accounting. Until final probate, no agent of Lady Vale may approach within 1 mile of Miss Larson's person or property. Lady Vale took one step forward as if to speak again. Guards moved first. Her bracelets struck together with a thin metallic chime as they escorted her out. She did not look back. When the court cleared, sunlight broke briefly through the high windows and lit the evidence table in a narrow strip. The forged writ with red ribbon, Pritchard's statement sanded and sealed, Niall's dispatch copy, Captain Larson's tide page now enclosed in protective vellum, the recovered South Shoal ledger, and the brass compass resting beside them. Nothing remained uncounted, nothing remained unnamed. Thorne signed the transfer registry as witness. Rebecca signed as principal heir in a hand that did not tremble. That evening she stood in the doorway of the North Spit cottage, key warm from her own palm, and listened to the old hinges complain exactly as they had in her father's time. Dust lay thick on the sill. 2 panes were cracked, the roof would need mending before winter, and the ledger room smelled of damp cedar. It was still hers. Mrs. Davies arrived before dark with a basket. Tears she wiped away at once, and a bundle wrapped in plain linen. 3 books bought back quietly from the harbour bookseller after Niall gave public notice of restored title. Mrs. Dobb sent fresh bread. Harlan sent a note in a stiff hand, thanking her for his hands, and enclosing the deckhand boy's name, Thomas Reed, written so she would know he had slept through the afternoon, and asked for her once on waking. On the 3rd morning after judgment, Thorne came to the cottage without escort, set a stack of estate ledgers on her father's old table, and remained standing until she joined him. The room was cold. Light from the east window striped the pages in pale gold. Blackwater shipping and North Spit routes are now legally entangled through the court remedy, he said. I can appoint stewards and keep you distant, or I can ask what I should have asked first. He pushed the top ledger toward her, opened to blank partnership leaves. Choose with me. She read the figures, the proposed terms, the clauses granting independent signatory power in her name, The protections against transfer without her written consent. No trap hid in the margins, no false stroke lifted at the end. She looked up at him. His face was the same winter stone the harbour feared, but his hands were bare on the table, open, waiting. "On one condition," she said. "Name it." No doors closed against those with work-worn hands. "Not in this house. Not in yours." A pause, then a single nod. "Done." She signed the partnership first. He signed beneath her. When he offered marriage after, he did it without flourish, without possession, in the same grave voice he used for orders and truth. She accepted in the same room where her father taught her tied arithmetic, with the ledgers between them and the sea audible beyond the glass. By Michaelmas, the house on North Spit had lamps in every lower window. Clerks and sailors entered by the front hall. When they had cause, Mrs. Davies kept the keys, and Rebecca gave instructions at her own table while the compass rested near her inkstand, pointing true.